Okay, well, thank you for inviting me along this evening. You've already heard a bit about me, and for about the next 30 minutes, we're going to delve into the wonderful world of bumblebees. I'm going to dispel a few myths for you around bees, and consider reasons that bumblebees are declining, and look at all the different ways that we can help bumblebees to thrive again. First off, I'll tell you a little bit about the trust. There we go. So the Bumblebee Conservation Trust was established in 2006 by Professor Dave Goulson to address some serious concerns about the plight of the bumblebee. He and fellow scientists recognised that something needed to be done if we were going to reverse the decline in our bumblebees. Bumblebee Conservation Trust is essentially a science-based and evidence-led charity, which has been key to a lot of our successes over the last 17 years. We act and get results from research. That wasn't meant to happen yet. There we go. And we take a balanced and evidence-supported actions to help bumblebees. We've currently got around 50 staff and we're growing a lot. We've got a lot of new projects up and coming. We've got hundreds of volunteers and thousands of members across the country. So what are bumblebees? In terms of taxonomy, they're animals, so they're in the kingdom Animalia. They belong in the phylum Eunoramia, the class Insecta with all the other insects, and the order Hymenoptera. The characteristics of that order are having 2 pairs of wings, prominent antennae, and usually 9 or more segments in, and biting mouth parts. They're in the family Apidae with all the rest of the bees, and the genus Bombus, which means booming, and they're named for the noise that they generate in flight. We've got 24 species in the UK and over 250 identified species in the world. They're social insects, so they live together in colonies, usually underground in rodent burrows or on the surface of ground in rougher tussocky grasses. There's one species in the UK that like to nest up high, and I'll tell you a bit more about them later. We also have cuckoo bees, which have some rather antisocial traits, but they're still a social species as they live in colonies. Cuckoo bees are nest usurpers. They like the cuckoo birds, which is where they get their name from. The cuckoo species will invade the nest of their preferred host. Each of the 6 cuckoo species we find in the UK look superficially similar to their preferred hosts. They'll locate a nest and they'll loiter outside for a few days. We think they're trying to take on the scent of the colony to avoid being ejected. They'll often kill the resident queen, but they'll allow the workers to live, and the workers will feed the brood of their own eggs, which are laid in the nest. Cuckoo bees don't produce workers, they just produce queens and males. And from the point the original queen is killed, the cuckoo takes over the nest, and it's essentially a zombie nest. Young will be reared to maturity, and the nest will just fade away because they're not producing any new workers. So over the last 80 years, we've seen 2 bumblebees become nationally extinct. One is colourless bumblebee, which hasn't been recorded since 1941, and the other, the short-haired bumblebee, which hasn't been recorded since 1988. There are several other species which were once common and widespread that now exist only in small and quite isolated populations. Bumblebees are a cold-adapted species. They wear this big fur jacket and they generate an awful lot of body heat through using their wings. They can fly when most other insects find it too cold in temperatures as low as 9 or 10 degrees Celsius. On a full honey stomach, a bumblebee can fly for about 40 minutes. After that, they're really in trouble and they need to find resources fast. If you find a drowsy bumblebee, the best thing to do is place them on a flower nearby. Please never take them into your home. They won't survive inside and they can't find the resources they need there. If there aren't any flowers nearby, sugar or honey diluted with water is okay as a last resort. Another great fact about bumblebees is that and bees in general, is that they know when a flower doesn't have any resources because someone else has visited and fed there recently. This is to do with the transfer of positive ions, which bees pick up when flying, and they get transferred onto the flower, which usually has a slight negative charge before a bee visits. It leaves an electrical hint for the next bee that this flower won't have any resources available for a little while the nectar cup refills on the plant. So, myth busting. This is the absolute pinnacle of my career. I love Mythbusters as a TV show, and I'm just, for the next few slides, going to star in my own little episode. So we're going to look at bumblebees and honeybees, a tale of 2 different stings, and if bumblebees really do defy the laws of physics. So When the media speak about the bee, they're often referring to the honeybee, which can confuse things sometimes. So we're going to look at the main differences between honeybees and bumblebees. Firstly, bumblebees are native wild pollinators. They don't depend on humans for care. They will feed from the flowers in our gardens and on our flowering crops, but they'll live here quite happily without us. Honeybees, on the other hand, do tend to depend on the efforts of their beekeepers to keep them alive, and they're not really native fauna to the UK. They've been here for a long time, but they're not strictly speaking native species. The keepers keep them in hives and treat them with medicines and keep the hive clean for them. So in the UK, they're mostly domesticated, and they're like a farm species. We farm them for honey. They aren't endangered, and they aren't suffering the same declines as our bumblebees. You'll find the odd feral colony in the UK, but essentially they're a Mediterranean species. Our CEO, Jill, I often quote her as saying, telling me that you're saving honeybees, telling me that you're saving bees by keeping honeybees is like saying I'm saving the birds by keeping chickens. The blending bees, there is a lot of debate about those bees. I always like to throw this one in, but the general consensus in the scientific community seems to be that they're an ecotype, which were quite common before importing honeybee queens became a more regular practice. If honeybees were ever native to the UK is actually still debated in the scientific community. There are a lot more species of bumblebee, so we've got 1 honeybee and 24 species of bumblebee. There are different races, so as we've talked about, like ecotypes, but that's similar to different forms of plants. They're still the same species, they're just a different colour or a slightly different pattern. There's a vast difference in colony size. Bumblebees, depending on species, will have somewhere between 50 to 400 workers in their nest. The nest is usually about the size of a football. A honeybee nest is much bigger and can have up to 50,000 workers in it. Honeybee colonies can easily outcompete our native bumblebees for resources, and they don't get any help from human carers when times are tough. Beekeepers will sometimes move a hive when one area becomes depleted in resources, which leaves bumblebees at a huge disadvantage because they can't do that. Unfortunately, bumblebees haven't learnt to dance yet, much like myself. Honeybees have been gathering food doing a really intricate little dance, which tells other bees where to go and find food outside the hive. Bumblebees don't do that, but we do think that they pass information between themselves about which flowers are in season through passing pollen grains and scents to each other. In bumblebees, only the new queen survives the winter, so they'll feed up in the late summer and autumn, and they'll hibernate somewhere underground, usually somewhere north facing, which avoids them being woken up by that one nice day we have in February, when there really won't be very many resources for them. In honeybees, the colony does survive the winter. The queen will survive winter, and so will some of the workers, and that's why they make honey, to feed themselves through the winters when there aren't any flowers blooming. Finally, bumblebees are struggling because of flower shortages caused by habitat change, which we'll talk more about later. Honeybees are struggling due to diseases such as the varroa and various viral infections. These can be treated by honeybee keepers and kept at bay with good husbandry. Sadly, we do have now some evidence to suggest that some diseases common in honeybees are able to spread into native bumblebees, like the deformed wing virus, for example. So, honeybees and bumblebees. Honeybees do die when they sting you. They have a barbed stinger. It gets caught in the skin and it's pulled out of the bee as they fly away. Bumblebees don't have a barbed stinger, so that doesn't happen if a bumblebee stings. Bumblebees rarely sting though, unless they feel really threatened. I tend to think of them like small flying pandas. They're actually really gentle. Male bees of either species cannot sting at all. They don't have a stinger. So, we've got, in the UK, we have about 270 species of bee, as we've already covered. There are 24 bumblebees and 1 honeybee. The rest are solitary bees. Solitary bees are bees that don't have workers, they don't form colonies, and they don't have help to raise their offspring. The adults mate, the females make a nest where she lays her egg. She'll leave some food in the chambers for the developing offspring, and she'll seals up the nest. The young develop inside the nest and emerge the following year as adult bees. In contrast, bumblebees and honeybees have a queen and many workers to help raise more offspring. It tends to be the bee homes that you buy in garden centres and places like that are aimed actually at solitary bees, not bumblebees. So when is a bee not a bee? Well, when it's a fly. We have some spectacularly good bumblebee mimics. And the best way to tell is by looking at the head. So flies have absolutely huge eyes. They take up about 80–90% of the head. Bees have fairly big eyes, but not quite as big. The antennae, so bumblebees have quite long antennae. They'll have 12 or 13 segments on there. Flies have short stumpy antennae with 3 segments and an arista, which is the stiff hair right at the end of the antennae. But still, yeah, very convincing mimics, and it's really easy to get them muddled up. So the bumblebee life cycle, if we have a look at that, if we start in early spring, the first part of the life cycle would be the queens emerging from hibernation. At that point, they've used up all their stored resources over winter and they're now pretty hungry, which is why early flowering species of plant are really important to bumblebees. Willow especially is great. They love willow. It's a really good source of pollen in early spring. Without these resources, the new queens who are already carrying fertilized eggs wouldn't be able to establish a nest. So once the nest is established, the queen will continue to forage for resources to feed the brood until the first workers, who will all be female, mature and take over that duty for her. After this, the queen doesn't leave the nest again. Workers will only live for around 28 days, and the continued rearing of new workers is essential until the nest is ready to produce males and new queens. Similarly, males have quite a short lifespan, around the same length as the workers. They never collect pollen or nectar for the nest. They simply feed themselves and look for a queen to mate with. They take a much slower and more luxurious pace to life than the busy little workers. So if you find a bee that's kind of hanging out on a flower, looking rather happy and chilled, it's usually a male. They're always the easiest ones to get a good photo of. There are 2 reliable ways to make sure a bumblebee is or isn't male. So on the top photo over here on the life cycle, you can see the pollen basket, this lump of pollen that's stuck to the leg of the bee. So that will be a worker or a queen, because males don't have pollen baskets. If you have a bee that you've potted, so we quite often will catch bees in a net and we'll put them into a plastic or glass pot to have a better look at them. Females have a pointed rear end because they have a stinger there. Males are much more gently rounded because they don't have a stinger. Following mating, the new queen will feed herself up for the long winter hibernation. The time of year that happens is dependent on species. Our early bumblebees aren't so called because they appear particularly early in the year. It's actually because the new queens will be looking to hibernate much earlier than other species, usually around the end of August. So they disappear a lot earlier than some of our other species. So the big 6, these are probably the most likely bumblebees that you'll see in your gardens. Of course, you might find something that's not on this list, and I'd be quite jealous. These are illustrations of the queens and what the queens look like. The workers are usually just a smaller version of the queen. The males can be different depending on species. We're always happy to help you with identifying bumblebees. If you go to our website and you've got a good photo or 2 of the bumblebee that you'd like to identify, find the inquiries email address and pop them over to us. We're only too happy to help you. My little fun fact here is it's only the hair on the bumblebees which is actually coloured. So if you pulled all the hair out of a bumblebee, and please don't do that, the bee would actually be entirely black and shiny. Looks a bit like a beetle. So the big 6 became the big 7 in about 2001. This little guy arrived from France, the tree bumblebee. And as you can see from the map, they've made their way up the country quite impressively in that time. I've seen them as far north as Montrose in Scotland. They're largely an urban bee, and as the name suggests, they tend to nest in crevices in trees. So these are the guys that like to nest up high. They'll also use a bird box or the eaves of your house or another structure. If you see a bumblebee that isn't nesting in or on the ground, it's almost certainly a tree bumblebee. Our science manager describes them as Neapolitan ice cream with these 3 distinct stripes. This makes them one of the easiest to identify in the field, and the queens, workers and males all look the same. In the summer, the males might accumulate at the entrance to a nest and look a bit like a swarm, but bumblebees don't swarm like honeybees. This is entirely natural behaviour, and they're just waiting for new queens to emerge from the nest to mate with. Bumblebees are not by nature aggressive unless they feel threatened, and the males won't be able to sting you anyway. So it's really nothing to worry about. Once the new queens emerge, the males will disperse, and it's actually really great to watch. So we are looking at the difference between honeybees and bumblebees, and a lot of this unbelievably, comes down to tongue size. So the honeybee worker, they all have tongues of pretty much the same size, and that means that they can pollinate a much more limited range of crops and wildflowers. Bumblebees come in lots of different shapes and sizes, and within each species, there's actually quite a lot of variation in the size of their tongues there as well. This means bumblebees pollinate a much broader range of crops and wildflowers, and can manage to pollinate everything that honeybees do. So what sort of crops are pollinated by bumblebees? And the answer is an awful lot. So this is just a small selection of crops and fruits that would be pollinated by a bumblebee. Anecdotally, I often hear people say that 1 in every 3 mouthfuls of food we eat are down to bees. But these days I'd venture it might actually be a bit higher. So if we're looking at things like hay, which we're feeding to dairy and meat producing animals over winter, the nutritional value of the herbs in it is actually tends to be better for the animals than just grass. And fodder crops that we grow for livestock over winter are grown from seeds. So even if they're harvested before they flower, they must be flowering somewhere to produce the seeds. Couple that with the rise of vegetarian and vegan lifestyles, and I think we can thank bumblebees and other pollinators for an awful lot of the food we eat. The sale of commercial bumblebee nests has become a multi-million-pound industry. We simply can't produce the food that we need in this country now without importing bumblebees from the rest of Europe in boxes. We just don't have enough pollinators. And bumblebees are the only insects which will pollinate tomato crops. So here are the boxes. In a tomato house, it would be somewhat laborious to go and pollinate all of those with a tuning fork. It brings its own unique issues with it. There's always a danger of introducing a novel pathogen or pest species. However much screening happens, things can be missed, which would be quite devastating for our native bumblebees. So why are bumblebees declining? We've established that they're really important pollinators, so why are they having such a hard time? Well, we've seen a lot of changes since the 1940s. We've lost about 97% of our flower-rich grasslands, which are incredibly important bumblebee habitat. This has been because agriculture changed, which meant that we could produce more food, but it's made the countryside a lot less useful for wildlife. So we've seen the landscape change from scenes like this to far more things like this. Monocultures of grass, which doesn't do the bumblebees any good. They can't eat grass. Climate change has its impacts. You might think things warming up would be good for insects, but bumblebees are a cold adapted species. Our great yellow bumblebees are one of the primary, just about clinging on in the far north of Scotland. Climate change could have really catastrophic impacts for them. Pesticides and the rise of pesticides. Neonics aren't the only ones. They have massive implications for bees, but so do many other commonly used chemicals. As gardeners and the general public, a good example of this is off-the-shelf Roundup that you can buy in a garden centre or supermarket near you. The Roundup active ingredient, which is glyphosate itself, isn't the main issue for bees. Other chemicals in the mixture have recently been shown to be having a much bigger issue, causing lethal and sublethal impacts on our bumblebees. Unfortunately, the government standard testing in the UK only tests the active ingredient on bees. So finding out it was actually the rest of the mixture that caused the bigger issues has been quite slow. So let's not finish with bad news. There's lots of good news, and there's lots of things that we can do to help bumblebees, large and small actions, and everyone can take one. So gardening for bumblebees. After farming, gardening is one of the biggest land uses in the UK. Gardens represent a great opportunity to help bumblebees because gardeners like to have lots of flowers all year, just like bumblebees do. However, it's important to have the right kinds of flowers available too, from at least March to September, which is when most of our bumblebee species are active. One of the most important things I think gardeners, myself included, needs to do is stop calling native species weeds. Changing the language we have changes the attitude that people have. Let's start calling them beautiful native flowers instead. It's important to keep the garden bullies under control, of course. Species like bramble and nettles will quickly take over and bully your more delicate plants out of their spaces. But both will tolerate being cut back quite hard, and both are actually really delicious. One of the wonderful things about gardens and allotments is the sheer variety of plants and styles of gardening. It creates an abundance of resources for bumblebees and supports a variety of species that need different resources. More and more people are starting to create mini meadow areas that would have been previously regularly cut as lawn. This is a brilliant practice and really valuable to both native plants and animals. I implemented this when I moved into my new home in May 2019. I started out just not mowing the front garden to see what we had, and it turned out one of the things I had there were bee orchids, which is this picture down here in the bottom corner. So since then, mowing only happens in my front garden between October and March, and I cut small paths through it just to make it clear to anyone that thinks I'm being lazy that it's actually intentional. If it's something that you'd like to do, the take-home message really is see what you have by letting it grow for a year or two before you start introducing seeds. Plants that occur naturally and locally will have the most benefit for the environment that you're gardening in. If you do want to source seeds, think local first, or at least make sure that the person you're buying the seeds from is producing them from the UK. You're always welcome to contact the Trust if you want more advice on creating your own little meadow. So what flowers? Well, unfortunately, many of the plants available in garden centres aren't that good for bumblebees. The heavily bred plants don't produce an awful lot of pollen and nectar, and others have really complicated flowers with lots of petals, and they actually block access to the food for the bees. Plants that have been bred by horticulturalists to look nice, but sometimes that's all they do, they just look nice. These plants include most kinds of pansy, begonia, some of the highly coloured primroses and petunias. I'd also caution wariness of plants labelled as pollinator friendly in your local garden centre. It never hurts to ask the staff if they're chemical free and are organically grown. If that question gets asked enough, it might just trigger a rethink in how we're growing and sourcing these plants. Some of the chemicals used on plants that are grown in nursery situations linger in the tissues and actually have negative impacts on the insect visitors long after the last application of chemical pesticides. Hanging baskets are really popular displays, and for a good reason. Done well, they're beautiful. A lot of species mentioned in the previous slide tend to be choice plants for hanging basket displays, and I'd never suggest that you stop planting something that's your favourite. But mixing in a few pollinator-friendly plants really helps to maximise the value of your garden and your displays for bumblebees. Native low growers and trailers work well, and species which are commonly grown in gardens can add a lot of value. Edible hanging baskets are also great and attract bumblebees and are useful to you and the pollinators. Try a mix of nasturtiums and trailing tomatoes, or strawberries and creeping thyme. The bonus of the second basket is that it's perennial, so it will last you for years. There is even a trailing sweet pea available to buy now, which I might have a go with this year and see how it does in my hanging baskets. Well, composting is a great way to save some money, creates a sustainable approach to using your food, garden and paper waste, and it provides resources for bumblebees too. Bumblebees might hibernate or even nest in the compost piles, so it's important to consider that before you start moving piles which are ready to use. Spreading compost over winter and early spring, I would recommend a slow and mindful approach, and just check you're not waking anyone up too early. It's not just bumblebees. Last year, I gently evicted about 20 slowworms from my compost bin and into the compost bin next door at the start of the spring. A blossom sequence can be really useful if you're trying to work out if you've got gaps in your flowering sequence. So all the table is here is a list of different plants, and the coloured squares show me when they flower. Once I get to the bottom of the table, I tot up how many species are flowering each month and see if there's anywhere I need to pad it out a bit. And here's a short animation we've recently created, which will show you how to provide nesting spaces in your garden for bumblebees.
This is a beautiful bumblebee queen, and she's on a mission to find the perfect spot to build her nest and raise the next generation. Bumblebees are wild pollinators, and unlike honeybees, don't live in hives. Changes to our landscape means good nesting spots and flowers are now in short supply. Homeless and hungry, today's bumblebees are in trouble, which is a big problem because they're key pollinators of wild flowers, fruit and vegetables. Different bumblebee species like to nest in different places, so here are 3 simple ways you can make them feel welcome in your outdoor space. Let a patch of grass grow long and tangled for bumblebees who like to nest on the ground. Put up a bird box with some nesting material inside for bumblebees who like to nest up high. Many bumblebees nest underground in abandoned mouse holes. Queens will search in wilder, undisturbed corners, so don't be too tidy. If you're lucky enough to discover a nest on your patch, just leave it be and enjoy watching the queen's offspring coming and going. Nests only last a few months until new queens finally hatch and head out into the world to mate and hibernate. So by helping just one bumblebee queen to find a home, you're doing something amazing for the future of bumblebees. bumblebeeconservation.org/be-the-change. This is a
so we have a huge amount of resources available on our website. So what is Be Kind? It's a tool that the Trust have produced. You can find a rating for how good your garden is if you put in the size of your garden and the flowers you grow on the list. Your Be Kind score will increase as you add the species, and at the end you'll be told how good the score is for a garden that size and given more recommendations. All of the flowers in the list are good for bumblebees, so you can use it as a reference for bee-friendly plants too. If you can use it to find flowers by colour, by flowering month, and you can so it's especially useful if you realise you do have a gap and you want to find out what can fill it. You can also look for certain types, so you can look for perennials, you can look for shrubs, you can look for trees. There's Be the Change, which is all about small actions that everyone can take to help bumblebees. Sometimes making a difference isn't about a huge lifestyle change. It's about taking a small action one at a time. And this web page details all different kinds of actions that people can take for bumblebees. We're starting to see a lot more areas in our public places like the one in the photograph, which I think are great. Little bits of public open space that are left to be a bit more wild. Talk to your local council or the people that manage your community spaces and ask them to do more for pollinators. The more requests they get, the more likely they are to implement something. If your local authority already do this, give them some feedback and tell them you think it's great. Ask them to relax the mowing in some areas or seed meadow strips on the verges or the less used parts of the public park. There's plenty of space for everyone there. Ask them to reconsider how they manage the hedges. A 2 to 3 year cutting cycle is much more beneficial than every year for a hedge. Many of the species in a hedge will flower on second year wood. So by cutting them every year, we're actually removing the majority of the flowering stems. When new developments are going in near you, ask them to make the planting plans pollinator positive. If the developer doesn't know how to do that, direct them to me. That's what I'm here for. Annual and pictorial meadows. These are great and they work really well for bumblebees. You often see these on the roadside verges. They do rely on regular soil disturbance to persist. So they're always best off if you're going to put one in somewhere that you can get to it regularly or used as a nursery crop for a perennial seed mix. Again, with this, local seeds are always best, but failing that, a little bit of due diligence on the company you order from and make sure that they're at least sourced from the UK. It might seem like a small detail, but it's a genetic provenance issue. So seeds that are coming in from Europe, they're likely to be quite genetically different to seeds that we would collect in the UK. And by introducing genetically different, even if it is the same species, we're diluting the fitness of our local plant populations, and it can have some unfortunate and unintended consequences. Another thing you could do to help bumblebees is get involved in our work. So you could do a bee walk survey. It's a national scheme, it's a citizen science scheme, and it's basically what we use to form a picture of how bumblebees are doing across the UK. You take yourself out for a nice walk once a month. You use a set route, which you choose yourself, and you record the bumblebees you see along the way, the number of each species, and if you're confident to do so, the plant they were feeding on. One of the bonuses that you would only really do that on a nice sunny day, so it's not like you have to go out in the wind and rain. There are lots of resources and support available to help you get started with that, and no one expects you to be an instant expert. There's an option there to just record a bumblebee if you didn't recognise one, or one flew past you too quickly to be sure. Richard, our science manager, has some YouTube training videos available, and he's also a really great entertaining presenter. You can join us, you can become a member, you can receive regular updates about our work via Buzzword, and the lowdown on all the latest scientific research via the Bombus Review, which is published 3 times a year. But the take-home message really is that small sustained actions are enough to be the change for our bumblebees and lots of other native wildlife. So thank you for joining me this evening. It's been a real pleasure to be here, and any time we have left, I'm happy to answer any questions you might have.